I'm Rick Casey. This is Dr. Patrick Kelly of UTSA, historian specializing in the Civil War in Texas. So Patrick, let's start very quickly about the secession convention, why that took place, and then we'll talk about what came after.
After Lincoln was elected, slaveholders in the South thought that he was going to abolish slavery or attempt to abolish slavery. That was not true. Lincoln's game plan was to contain slavery where it existed and let it die over time, die on the vine, as it were. But Southern slaveholders couldn't accept that. So they felt like their best bet was to leave the Union, as one historian said, to commit suicide rather than wait for slavery to die. So Texas was one of those first tier of states, starting from Texas and going to South Carolina. It actually went from South Carolina to Texas to leave the Union. Virginia and the Upper South didn't leave the Union until after Fort Sumter. So Texans left the Union in January of 1861. Governor Sam Houston was opposed to secession, not because he was...
President Sam Houston at that time, yes.
Well, governor, he was governor of the state.
Okay.
In 1861. He opposed secession because he was a unionist. He didn't care about slaves, or he was a slaveholder himself, so he wasn't an emancipationist. So what happened was you had a secession convention that met outside the Texas legislature and voted 166-6 to leave the Union in late January of 1861.
And so this is a few months before Fort Sumter.
Yes.
And yet Texas is in the forefront. Then there was an incident at the Arsenal here in San Antonio, which I thought is fascinating.
There was a gap between the secession convention vote and the popular vote. Texas was one of the few southern states that had a popular vote, which was overwhelmingly in favor of secession. But there was about a month gap between the convention and the popular vote. What you had in San Antonio at the Federal Arsenal, which is now where HEB headquarters is, you had about $1.5 million worth of weapons, which today would be about $50 million worth of weapons, because about 3,000 U.S. soldiers were stationed in Texas because of the Indian threat and the threat from the border. So Ben McCullough came with about a couple of hundred volunteers, came to San Antonio and captured the arsenal. It wasn't a very tough fight. The U.S. Army officer in charge of the arsenal handed him the keys. He was a guy named Twiggs, General Twiggs. He was an older guy. He was a Georgian. He was happy to hand over the arsenal to the Texans. And also the 3,000 U.S. soldiers in Texas were shipped out. So what you had was one of the great early victories of the Confederacy happened in San Antonio in February of 1861, 2 or 3 months before Fort Sumter. And the other side of the story is that Robert E. Lee happened to be in San Antonio that day. He was still a U.S. Army officer because Virginia had not left the Union. Virginia doesn't leave the Union until after Fort Sumter. So Lee is going through San Antonio. He'd been fighting Comanches north of San Antonio. He's passing through San Antonio because Abraham Lincoln has called him to Washington to offer him to be the head of the Union Army. So Lee, coincidentally, is in San Antonio the day the arsenal's taken. He's horrified by what has happened. He later said privately that he would have fought the Texans, because remember, he's still a U.S. Army officer. The Texans don't trust Lee because he won't leave the Union Army. He won't pledge himself to the Confederacy yet. So he's kind of ridden out of town on a rail. And he never gets his luggage.
It's promised to him, but
it's promised. He goes to Indianola, goes to Washington, turns down Lincoln, obviously, and then joins.
Lincoln had asked him up to Washington to talk about him heading up the whole Federal Army.
Right, and Lee says no, of course, but he is in San Antonio the day the arsenal is taken.
One other quick thing. Lincoln also made an offer to Sam Houston.
Lincoln offered 50,000 troops to Sam Houston because he knew that Houston opposed secession. But Sam Houston said no, he couldn't fight Texans, and he was 68 at the time. He just was not ready for another adventure.
My age exactly. Patrick Kelly, UTSA, thank you very much.